Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 16th of May 2022. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. Good afternoon, Andy. Have you been up to anything interesting today?
The most interesting thing that's happened today is that it's emerged, thanks to the completion of the Metropolitan Police inquiry into so-called #Partygate, that our Prime Minister attended 7 parties in Downing Street, 6 of which at least were illegal, and only received 1 fine. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you think he was hiding in the shower the whole time? He was like, I'm just a rubber ducky. This is my home. Oh, yes. If a glass of wine ends up in here and I happen to be at home, that's fine. But was that the case?
Well, some legal commentators are suggesting that because technically it's his house, that was his get out. But
sorry.
Look, you mentioned hiding the show. I prefer the comment from at least one sort of commentator this morning when the news broke, who said that the whole situation reminded them of the old Western movie when the bad guy walks into the saloon and goes for his guns, and the sort of coward dives into the piano and emerges a few minutes later with everybody else lying dead on the floor.
I was never here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
I suspect this story has further to run.
It probably does. The formal Sue Gray report, that's a civil servant for people who don't know, is now free to come out because the police investigation is concluded, with a total of 126 fines being issued. Now, the reason why we're rabbiting on about this is because I think it's important to note, and it has been noted by Mr. James O'Brien of LBC, that Number 10 Downing Street was the only place in the country that was making the rules and then obviously passing them through Parliament for approval on lockdown. But it seems to have been the largest single breaker of the rules in the country as well. So
I think you could argue they were just field testing how effective the rules actually were.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was a very effective test, I suppose, yeah. But anyway, hopefully our ongoing Watching Brief will continue without such egregious and annoying things in it. Although we are about to have a bit of a debate, aren't we not, on the merits of old buildings?
Absolutely, and it does have a parliamentary angle, and
and it's kind of picking up on a video that I published a couple of weeks ago about our relationship to the past. And well, I think you were saying that it also has connections to last week's Watching Brief as well.
Absolutely, because we were discussing heritage skills, and that figures very largely in this particular story as well. But we'll come to that later.
Yeah. Well, exactly, because before then, we have a series of links to catch you up on and things for you to take a look at. So we're going to start with an update on Montpelier. You may recall a couple of weeks ago we were talking about the situation there and the seemingly rather bad blood between governance and a group representing descendants of people who had worked the plantations. And this is from Cultural Heritage Partners Law Policy Strategy.com. Embattled Montpelier votes at last to share governance with descendants. Is this, as far as you can tell, is this an amicable end to things?
I think it's difficult to say how amicable it was. It's certainly, at the moment anyway, an end to the standoff, really, that had developed at the Montpelier estate, President Madison's Montpelier estate, which is a National Heritage Site in the States. This is a press release, in fact, related to Greg Werkheiser, who's an American lawyer and was working with the Montpelier Descendants Committee, who are a group of people who are descended from people primarily enslaved African people who worked on the estate.
Yeah.
And they wanted parity with the existing board of directors in Montpelier, so that the stories of their ancestors and the contribution of enslaved African people to the estate and to the development of America will be properly represented. there was a very messy situation that developed through the early part of the spring in March, April, which led to effectively members of staff, including the senior archaeologists, being fired. And in one case, somebody being fired while they were actually on holiday. Now, there does appear to be some kind of resolution. The board is being reconstructed. The MDC, Montpellier Descendants Committee, are going to be well, as one of their founding members, James French, says in a press release, if our candidates have voted fully vested in the board at today's meeting, and if the foundation does not engage in any future acts of retaliation, that's mentioning referencing the firing of staff who'd supported the MDC's point of view, then Montpellier can at last begin to fulfil its potential as one of the nation's brightest stars among museums and cultural institutions. In this unique partnership with descendants, we will study the past with commitment to the present and build hope for the future. Well, it appears that has come about. The board is being reconstructed. The previous chair has gone, and they're talking about moving ahead to including rehiring of staff. So, fingers crossed, there are no more hitches, and the situation in Montpellier resolves itself.
But also as well, a more complete story about the site is free to be told.
Yes.
Neither favouring people at the top or people at the bottom of that particular food chain, as it were. So good stuff.
Yes.
Next, we have a link. Now, you're going to have to discuss this stuff because I've used up my free access to articles here from Apollo magazine. Starting with risky business. Why is New York getting rid of auction regulations?
Right. This is a story from the States. The city of New York, which obviously under the American system, states and even cities have a lot more autonomy in this case in Britain, certainly. And this comes at a time when fine art, high art, is fetching incredible amounts of money. The article quotes the recent sale of an Andy Warhol, the famous Andy Warhol silkscreen portrait of Marilyn Monroe, which has just gone for $195 million.
Yeah.
Now, when you have artifacts that are worth that amount of money, it is very tempting for bad actors to, for example, use them to launder money. You use dirty money to buy a high-end artifact, store it in a safe in a free port or a bank, and then you can produce it in a few years' time, sell it, and bank the proceeds which have been cleaned up through sale through an auction house.
Yeah.
The article cites issues like that. It also cites issues. Now, this is I'm the first person to be skeptical about the auction trade. I covered the sale of Sekemka, and there are still many questions outstanding about that. Though not suggesting anyone acted in any way illegally, but there are certainly a lot of suggestions about that sale of Sekemka from Roehampton Museum. But I'd not heard of this particular practice. It's called chandelier bidding. And apparently it is perfectly legal. But basically an auctioneer creates fake bids in order to get a work of art to the price floor, the reserve that the sellers agreed. And auctioneers are allowed to, quote, find bids that don't exist, I'm quoting the article here, in order to liven up the room and push the bidding into a competitive environment. Until last week, the activity was not allowed once the price floor had been breached, so that any competition between bidders from that point onwards was real. Now, auction houses can juice the bids as far as they like without breaking any rules. And that's because New York has basically deregulated the auction industry. Go on.
Well, that I mean, that's despicable, but also it's fascinating because actually there's been a very similar problem the sale of collectible computer games. I think we might have talked about this in a previous watching brief, actually, where you had a company that was doing precisely that. Actually, what they would, you'd have, so famously, I think a copy of Mario 64 sold for the most that a computer game's ever sold for, and it was, rated as like a 10 plus or something, or whatever. They have all these sort of ways of saying the box is pristine and no one's breathed on it, this kind of thing. And it came out that it seems to be standard practice for that company to make up bids in order to force up the price. They then get PR because they get to say, in this instance, well, we've got the most expensive computer game ever sold. But then also it means obviously that they're literally creating a market, and they're not allowing people in a. I mean, the thing is, who goes along with this? Like, free marketeers shouldn't be for this stuff, should they?
No, never mind. Point. I
mean, go on.
Well, look, the point's made in the article. This is meant to be about consumer protection. It's meant to be about minimising fraud. That's why you have protections built into systems like that. It's like informed consent when you're buying a product, like an insurance product.
So having the regulation is meant to be a protection. Yes. Yes. Okay. Right. I was going
to say. So why get rid of it? I mean, the City of New York, and you can only take them at their word, say they're doing this to create a more consumer-friendly environment. Now, again, this is Apollo magazine arguing that even some of the auction houses were just gobsmacked that this decision came down. And in fact, some of them have said they're not going to shift their practice, although the big houses, Sotheby's, hasn't, at least up to the time of publication, hadn't stated publicly how it was going to respond.
Right.
And I think the other thing that we need to mention in this context, just to wind this particular story up, is that this is also happening against a background of increased regulation, certainly within Europe, coming from the EU. Mm-hmm. And the British government has said that it, and in fact has put into practice, that it isn't going to fully align with EU rules. So there's going to be a looser arrangement in Britain. And in fact, that also ties in with the government's promotion of free ports. Free ports have been mentioned in connection with laundering stolen and looted artifacts and artifacts that are used for money laundering.
Yeah. Again, see previous watching briefs for stuff about that. This is the advantage of having a library of previous videos that we've done, and we have an archive. But anyway, next, also from Apollo magazine, and this one I think we should just touch on briefly because we have also touched on this in a previous watching brief. It's a comment and a discussion from Christina Riggs, who wrote on the 13th of May an article with the headline, "All photographs are products of their time and they should be treated that way." This is largely to do with questions surrounding things like colorization, getting rid of film grain, in this instance, we have an image, a very famous image now from Peter Jackson's "They Shall Not Grow Old," the film from 2018, which is, I think, it's on the cover of. It was on the poster, possibly. I think, but definitely on the cover of the DVD Blu-ray release. Officers at their meal in the mess, basically, an outdoor scene. Which on the left-hand side is cleaned up and colorized quite subtly. It's still got like a sepia tone. And on the right-hand side, it's black and white as was on film. You can see the film grain. You can see all the imperfections of that medium. And really, it's this always seems to spark quite a serious and impassioned, rather, conversation about legitimacy in this stuff. I think, for me, very, very briefly, I think my headline line on this is more or less, so long as you're not altering the original, and I think by virtue of playing with the negatives for the most part, you're not going to be altering the original. You're going to be going from the negatives and creating something in, for the most part, in a digital realm. Then this is an interpretation of an original piece of film, and I think that's probably a sensible way of looking at it. But there are questions around. I mean, I think when we first talked about this. You were saying, and indeed I remember other people having said this to me throughout my life, that people sort of grew up thinking that the Second World War was fought in black and white. Everyone was black and white until a certain point where everyone went poof and just became colourful. So so in that sense, it's important because it does ironically colour how we view the past, actually. And so in some ways, you could argue that colorizing reminds us that these were people with flesh and blood, rosy cheeks and lives to lose, as it were. So it's an ongoing conversation. This is a very interesting discussion that's been laid out in this article. I mean, what do you think on this, Andy?
It's something where actually my views have moved over the years, and now I'm absolutely of the view that so long as originals aren't damaged, it is perfectly legitimate to colorize or to restore. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of processes that can be involved in this. It's taking the Peter Jackson example, that they took black and white film from World War One, colorized it, cleaned it up, printed it at the right speed.
Yeah.
And and you end up with an incredibly vivid representation, impression of World War One Western Front. A couple of points I just make, and reasons I have changed my mind on this. First of all, it's the view that the moment color reproduction became available, for example, in Hollywood, became affordable, most people switch to it as the preferred medium.
Yes.
Occasionally, you'll get a director who'll shoot a film in black and white to make a creative point. Mm-hmm. But basically, color is seen generally as superior to black and white. Although black and white could be wonderful. One of my favorite movies ever is the Alfred Hitchcock Rebecca, that was made in, I think, 1940. Mm-hmm. Photographed by a very famous lighting cameraman called James Wong Howe, and it looks absolutely stunning, even though it's in black and white. But at the same time, colour stock was coming in. People might be familiar with the Errol Flynn Robin Hood. And the Hollywood director George Stevens took a team of Hollywood creatives to Europe to cover D-Day to the fall of Berlin in colour. They shot in colour. The famous film of the Battle of Midway, the attack on Midway Island by the Japanese, that was recreated in the recent in the recent film, was shot by John Ford, again famous Hollywood director. He shot it in colour as well for the American Navy. So there are those examples that were contemporary with the black and white images we're familiar with. And in fact, one of my favorite, and I'll just finish on this point, and one of my favorite Twitter accounts is run by a man called Stuart Humphreys, whose hobby effectively is restoring, he always says not recoloring, he always says restoring period color photographs, often using a process called autochrome. Mm-hmm. Which was in use in the early part of the 20th century, late 1890s, early 1900s. And the results are absolutely stunning. I urge people to look up his Twitter account. He's at Stuart Humphreys. We'll print the link because he spells Humphreys in a slightly unusual way. It's not the way you'd expect. So to avoid mistakes,
there's a Z in there for some reason. I don't know why.
Yeah, and the account is actually called Babel Color, Babl, capital COLOUR, Babel Color. It's wonderful account just to dip into. It's actually quite a life-affirming account to dip into. I mean, I'm looking at an absolutely beautiful photograph of a child with a Jack Russell dog that was taken 111 years ago, and looks as though it could have been taken today.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. Okay, well, if that was us being brief, I hate to think what's going to come next. Next we do have an ongoing reminder that you can check in on the UNESCO website to keep an eye on the list, ever-growing list, or the hopefully not for too much longer ever-growing list of damaged cultural sites in Ukraine, as verified by UNESCO. As of the 16th of May, so 3 days ago, as of filming, UNESCO has verified damage to 133 sites since the 24th of February. This includes 57 religious sites, 12 museums, 26 historic buildings, 16 buildings dedicated to cultural activities, 15 monuments, and 7 libraries. And I think, as we pointed out last week, the comparison between before and after on some of these sites is quite telling. Certainly, so there's that. But also as well, we've included a link to a PDF statement delivered on behalf of the countries listed below under Agenda Item 11 (brackets museums) close brackets during the 2022 International Committee for the Protection and Restitution of Cultural Property. Qu'est-ce que c'est? What is this?
It's simply a new statement of intent, really, from members of UNESCO. There are various conferences going on at the moment involving UNESCO. This statement was issued in Paris on the 19th, so today, in fact. It's literally hot off the press as we're going.
And it was in Paris. I didn't even know. Recording. And I spoke for just moi, c'est magnifique.
It's issued on behalf of a number of countries, and it's the committee. It's a statement on behalf of the Committee for the Protection and Restitution of Cultural Property, which is a UNESCO committee. It's meeting in Paris, and their agenda included Ukraine. It's a statement of what's going on as of this moment and UNESCO's point of view. It quotes, I'll just quote briefly from it. It's a shortish statement. The Ukrainian Deputy Minister for Culture and Information Policy, Ms. Katerina Chureva, has just described to this committee in devastating detail the damage done to Ukraine's museums in the 3 months since Russia's illegal, unprovoked and unjustified war against Ukraine. Ukrainian collections hosted in museums, cultural institutions and libraries which embody the heritage, creativity and history of Ukraine are under serious threat. And this is the important thing. People might remember we talked about the letter to British Archaeology that talked about attempts to remove important cultural collections from museum galleries and put them into safekeeping while the war goes on. The statement says many collections have not been relocated to safe storage spaces due to lack of time and the difficult conditions facing museum personnel. The rapid evolution of the conflict and Russia's bombing mean that even those collections which have been entirely or partially relocated are at risk.
Right.
And then it goes on to talk about Russia's responsibilities and responsibility of belligerents under international law. It talks about UNESCO working to safeguard cultural property, but then it concludes, when the time comes, the 1970 Convention about cultural properties in war, and the 1954 Convention, that's the Hague Convention, again about cultural property in conflict situations, and its protocols will play an important role in supporting the return of all looted items to Ukraine and in holding Russia to account for its actions. That appears to be a statement of intent that collections that are argued to have been looted, and we've talked about material allegedly being taken from Mariupol and so on. But also the individuals that were responsible for breaching international heritage law and convention, they may be facing consequences down the line. Or at least that's the intention of the UNESCO committee as of today.
Okay, so that's a statement of intent from UNESCO. And we also have a statement here from the Royal Historical Society, where in bold yellow and blue, or blue and yellow, they proclaim that 7 Scholars at Risk fellowships are to be awarded or have been awarded to Ukrainian historians and SEES specialists. Royal Historical Society joins with other learned societies to create a programme that will see 7 Ukrainian scholars housed and allowed to work, and taking them out of being at risk in a war zone. This is a very bold thing to announce. And well, I don't know. How do we say this politely? It would be really nice to see more of this sort of thing. There we go.
I think it's important to say here, well, a couple of things. First of all, if people aren't familiar with the term SEES, is Slavonic and Eastern European Studies.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
It's an academic field.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful example of people in higher education, in research, working together across borders to try and ameliorate an awful situation. So it's fellowships for 7 scholars from Ukraine who can't work at their home universities because of the war. It's enabling them to work in places, for example, the University of Sheffield,
Mm-hmm.
Ironically, Roehampton, which we'll come on to in a minute, and the University of West of England, but also Bremen in Germany,
Yeah.
University of Aberdeen and the University of Edinburgh, and the University of St Andrews.
Mm-hmm.
These have been funded by, and supported by the Royal Historical Society and various partners, which include the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies, Past and Present Society, the German Historical Society, the Ecclesiastical History Society, all working together. And I'm delighted to say an archaeological body is involved in this as well, the Society of Antiquaries.
Mm-hmm.
They're supporting the scheme, and they're going to be providing an 8th fellowship. It hasn't been announced yet where it's going to be, but the Antics have stepped up to the plate and are going to are joining this initiative, showing that archaeologists, at least some archaeological bodies, think it's important to work on international initiatives like this.
Okay, that's good. That's good. And well, as you just hinted, I mean, we're not really pretending that this is a preliminary section, are we? This is basically half the show, at least this week, because now after 25 minutes, we come to the end with news that's gathering pace. I've seen more and more people in the past couple of days, particularly today, noticing this, seemingly a resurgence of a plan. We're still tying down the exact details to cut apparently £3.2 million worth of arts and humanities at the University of Roehampton in East London? In London, in Nodnall. Well, I mean, it's been described by some people as the university is slashing half of its academic staff. That's another way of describing this. Again, we're still tying down the exact numbers and figures and what the implications are. We're linking below for now to the change.org website, the campaign for this, which currently has 9,836 signatures, currently aiming for 10,000. And this seems to be a go-to, doesn't it, in these cases? Sheffield knocked it out of the park, really, with their change.org website, in so much as it gathered such pace that they were surprised by the support that they got, and it was a really good tool to refer to in negotiations with the university. I mean, we can argue how and where that led, but nonetheless, this is a go-to bit of action in support of, or rather protest of, I suppose, the potential for cuts. Have we heard anything else during the course of the day? Because this came to my attention at 2:00 in the morning last night, when some people were announcing, for example, that they were no longer going to be doing external examinations for the university in protest. So has anything else come about during the day that you're aware of?
Well, this is a story that's been developing for a few days. It's been talked about in connection with Roehampton. University of Roehampton is in a leafy part of West London, in fact.
West London.
It's tucked in between Putney and Richmond, and just south of the Thames. And it describes itself as London's campus university.
Right.
It's a very leafy, very attractive university site. It has a good reputation for a number of courses, including courses in the humanities. And it's these that are under a threat. It's a story that has been running, though, and building over the last few days, not just about Roehampton, but also about other universities. For example, the University of Wolverhampton has frozen pretty much all of its performing arts and related courses for recruitment for at least a year. Right. And there will be redundancies associated with that. De Montfort University has been named as making cuts. There are other universities involved as well. The phrase "a bonfire of the humanities," I think, is applicable here. And the background to this is last year, the then Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, higher education should shut up and go away.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Sir Gavin Williamson, I'm sorry. Yes.
To you, pleb.
Sir Gavin, yeah. Anyway, the then Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, announced that the government would institute a policy of no longer funding subjects in certain areas which it regarded as non-strategic.
Yeah.
Which included the performing arts, media studies, philosophy, basically what are sometimes regarded incorrectly as the soft humanities.
Yeah. And again, we did cover all of this at the time, so people
did
can
cover all
relate.
of this
Yeah,
at the time.
yeah.
The story has returned with a vengeance this week, with potentially hundreds of academic jobs at risk, whole departments at risk, whole areas of study at risk. It's not just appalling for the individual members of staff concerned and the students concerned and the uncertainty. There are a number of really, I think, deep and knotty questions that need to be asked here. One is that you've got local university SMTs, senior management teams, making decisions about cutting whole departments that have just gone through the what's called the REV reviews for research reviews, where you've got high performing departments which the universities are happy to trumpet, and they're now looking to axe.
Yeah. Well, and this is a crucial part of the year for many universities, because lots of academic courses have been taught, exams are happening or have already happened. It depends on where you are. Right. And where so this is a time when they can announce that they're going to let people go, and they, in a sort of slightly corporate sense, they've built in, as it were, it's baked in the fact that they've got the resource of the teaching done, and now they can let go of people if they want to, if they deem it to be necessary.
This is the point. It's exactly what we saw at Sheffield and at Worcester last year.
Yeah,
that the cuts, the reviews were timed to take place towards the end of the academic year.
Yeah,
when it was more difficult to build up a head of steam to protest. The cuts are presented as a fait accompli. There's no pre-consultation.
No.
And that's another one of the fundamental questions. You've got these local university SMTs making what are essentially strategic national decisions about provision, which particularly impact where most of these universities, the post-92 former polytechnics, that became universities when universities were to a degree deregulated under the major government, and they've been operating as universities for the last 30 years. And what you're seeing now is, for a number of reasons, one is the government decisions on funding, and the other is the removal of what are called student caps, which means that some courses can be oversubscribed while others are undersubscribed. And it's very difficult to switch from one situation to another.
Yeah,
it drives academics trying to recruit. They get incredibly frustrated at how to get out of this particular bind.
Yeah.
And
also what we saw at Sheffield was that there was a way of describing the economics of the department that was designed to make it look as bad as possible, when it wasn't necessarily as bad as was being described. There are issues on recruitment and quality of education and housing that we've been talking about today before we recorded, but we won't necessarily go into now. Maybe next week, maybe sometime soon. But also as well, I think the end point here for this initiative, this upsum, is this is no way to run a year to year university offering. How can you plan a long-term research project? How can you, frankly, work without being stressed out of your mind? Work hard for your university if you think, oh, we're coming into spring, am I going to lose my job by the summer? This is not a good way of doing it. And as you say, without pre-consultation, without the ability to make those arguments back and forth in a substantial and also a multifaceted way that doesn't have fait accompli and doesn't decide to a priori, as it were, designate the notion of the economics being, this is just clear, without there being actually a proper discussion. It's only going to lead to, well, it could snowball. We could end up with staff simply, a culture of staff being stressed and concerned for their livelihoods and for the nature of their work, that could get out of control in terms of quality of teaching, in terms of the value for money, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think we saw that in Watching Brief, in the interviews we did with David Petts and Umberto Albarella for Durham and Sheffield, respectively, about the UCU industrial dispute, which was in progress before all the latest developments happened. if you talk to people in HE, they are often at their wits' end. They are stressed, they're tired, they've just come out of trying to keep courses going through COVID, and then they're being faced with situations like this. And there are, alongside this, there's a lack of trust in senior management. There are allegations, for example, that academics in high-performing departments are actually being made to pay the price for decisions that have been made, for example, really poor decisions around property developments. That certainly was an accusation in Chester, was also an accusation at Leicester. And underlying all of this, there are two social issues as well. The post-92 unis particularly attract recruitment from people from non-traditional student backgrounds. People who are first-time students, mature students, they draw from more local catchments than the Russell Group unis that people will have heard of: Bristol, Oxbridge, Durham, York, and so on. And so there's an issue of social engineering and social opportunity, and the denial of opportunity to kids from less privileged backgrounds, who might want to go into pursue an academic career.
Although I've definitely in person met people of my own age who think that I shouldn't have been in a university based on my background. So in that sense, it's actually not even an old fuddy-duddy attitude. There is a genuine class division at times. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the final point I would make is and I'm saying this particularly to members in the heritage and archaeology sector, who might say, well, what does it matter to us if a philosophy department goes at, for the sake of example, Roehampton or wherever, or even a history department goes? They're historians, they're archaeologists. In fact, given that so much of particularly developer-funded archaeology that people in the heritage sector do these days is to do with the archaeology of the medieval and the modern, historians have a huge input to that, into the context, the understanding of that, of those subject areas, and not to mention the other areas which again are often very strong in these kind of post-92 university departments, things like gender studies, things like colonial studies, and so on. Responding to local communities that might have a high, a strong mix of people from different ethnic backgrounds, and so on. If they go, opportunities to provide the context for archaeological work goes too, and that means archaeology, it's only ever half done. If you haven't got that documentary and historical context and can't apply it. Because again, archaeologists, we're not historians. A lot of archaeologists don't like handling documents. We work with historians who do, and it enriches both sides.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think Sheffield summed it up quite nicely with a banner that they put up saying, who's next, basically. And it raises the question, and as I say, that's no way to run a university. Have that hanging over you.
No.
So now we come to sort of the headline conversation in this week's Watching Brief, with the Architects Journal announcement in the headline, or pronouncement, I suppose, or revealing that Palace of Westminster refurb chiefs have been departing due to corrosive uncertainty. This is senior staff working on the planned and ongoing restoration of the Palace of Westminster have handed in their notice due to delays and corrosive uncertainty regarding the project. Mammoth scheme to restore and renew this UNESCO World Heritage Site has been delayed repeatedly in recent years, and this is largely due to the fact that Parliament wants to keep on sitting for as long as possible in the building. And this means that without politicians moving out, the project could cost up to £22 billion, that's billion with a B, and take 76 years, i.e. a person's lifetime to complete. Initially, what do you think of this? I mean, do you think this is just civic, as it were, civic engineering? Projects do cost more than they initially budget for. They do take longer than they initially estimate.
That's certainly the case, but I think there are particular complications here because it's Parliament. It's Parliament. It's the mother of Parliaments. It's an absolutely iconic building.
It's so-called Mother of Parliament. It calls itself the Mother of Parliament. I'm sure the French would disagree. Then go ahead.
Look, it's been the seat of government in England, certainly, since the time of William the Conqueror.
Mm-hmm.
London is the capital of England. It became the capital of Great Britain. It became the capital of the British Empire, for good or ill. And it was all run out of those buildings next door to Westminster Abbey. And when they burnt down in the 19th century, they were rebuilt as this sort of cathedral to good taste, art, technology, and the British political system, with those wonderful, Victorian Gothic interiors by Pugin and so on. So, there's no question that it is probably one of the most important buildings in Great Britain, if not Europe, if not the world. It thoroughly deserves its status as a World Heritage Site. The problem is how do you marry that to the fact that it has been deteriorating, visibly deteriorating, particularly since World War II. Mm-hmm. And when it still has to maintain the functions of the British state.
True. I mean, in many ways, not in many ways, I mean, it literally, actually, it embodies a vision of the relationship between commons, and this is a very specific legal term. It doesn't mean that you are common, but common folk, people who are lords, and also the sovereign, the monarch. There's something called Sovereign's Gate, where recently we had Prince Charles going through. We talked about this last week, and in order to set out the legislation for the coming term of Parliament. It's a building that embodies the unspoken and unwritten, in many ways, constitution that the British system rests on. But at the same time, I hate to say this, were it not Westminster, the Palace of Westminster, surely to goodness it would have been condemned, wouldn't it? The electrics are shot. There's mold on the ceiling. There's as you've said, you've seen in person. There's moss between the stonework. This is in many ways a dangerous building, and it's interesting that. So we have a headline here. It's MSN News, but quoting the Independent newspaper. Michael Gove, the Secretary for Levelling Up, has told the Lords, the House of Lords, that they should sit outside London during the refurbishment, and suggested that they go to Stoke-on-Trent, Burnley, and Sunderland potentially. Sunderland being up here in the northeast of England. I mean, I don't know how they'll make it up here. To be fair, it's so far to come. But no. In all seriousness, it's the intransigence of the idea of Parliament that's making this so egregiously expensive. And I can't help but wonder, connected to a video I made a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, called Trying to Avoid the Trap, Living in a Post-History World. Is this happening because we are living now and we have a very particular notion of what is historically worthy and valuable? In the past, a castle wasn't a visitor site. It was a functional building, and when that function changed, it changed. I've talked to you in preparation in the agenda for this week's Watching Brief about Warkworth Castle, which went from being a fort or a fortress to being essentially a holiday home, and no one was protesting. No one was outside going, "You can't do that. It's a listed building." But we live in a curious age where we do kind of designate things as being, this is historical, this is listed. We're going to try and fix this in aspic. Counter to the very, and I hate to get dramatic here, to the very laws of nature. Thermodynamics dictates everything crumbles. If it didn't, I hate to say it, Andy, we'd have nothing to dig up. So, why don't we? And I'm asking in a genuinely open way, why don't we start again? And not that long ago, in the mid 1800s, they decided to start again. A new vision of Parliament was made. Why don't we do it again this time, instead of spending I won't live, you won't live to see this completed, this project?
Well, first of all, I would say that you talked about Warwick Castle and the fact that it changed function over its life. So has the Palace of Westminster. The clues in the word palace. It began life as a royal palace.
Yes.
It because it was a royal palace and had the space for the king to convene Parliament, or the Queen, in certain parts of our history, astonishingly enough. But Parliament was convened at the monarch's convenience in their Palace of Westminster. But it ceased to be a royal palace after the Civil War. People might be familiar with that the only parts of the old Palace of Westminster that survive are the Royal Banqueting Hall, designed by Inigo Jones, up Whitehall, certain cellars under newer buildings, and what's the Great Hall of the Palace, the Great Norman Hall of the Palace, which survives. And in fact, you use if you come in to visit Parliament as a pedestrian, as a visitor, you come in through the Westminster Hall, and through this enormous medieval room built for William the Conqueror, where monarchs and the great and the good lie in state before major state funerals, and you go through this remaining piece of the medieval royal palace into the central lobby between the House of Lords and House of Commons. So it's you actually walk through the history of the building from its royal origins to its modern function as a palace of democracy, and that's part of the problem. You have these absolutely fabulous juxtapositions of architecture from the genuine medieval through to the pastiche Victorian Gothic, which is still pretty stunning. But then you look up close and you start to see the cracks. Literally, you start to see, as I told you, you mentioned the moss that is growing between the stones in some of the courtyards and so on. These the issues they've got with electrics, with asbestos, with also anything that can go wrong with a building that's been existing in existence for the last 150 years, nearly 200 years. They are dealing with at the Palace of Westminster.
So by definition, really, it's not built to code because it was built before there was a code.
That's part of the problem. And at the same time, we don't condemn a building just because it's had to be rewired a few times. And the analogy I would draw is our great medieval cathedrals. And again, I mentioned to you in the preamble, I come from just outside Canterbury, and there's been a rolling program of refurbishment and restoration and rebuilding at Canterbury Cathedral since I was a teenager. So the decision is made that these buildings need to be retained, restored, continue to be given life.
And and as we were talking about last week, actually, this ties in with places like York Minster and other buildings where they have that ongoing rolling program of restoration. In fact, we're linking below to the restoration and renewal.uk House of Parliament Restoration and Renewal website, where one of the top things that pops up is work with us. Find out about ways that you can learn these skills. Basically, you too can become a part of this and go away with a new apprenticeship, through apprenticeship with a new career.
You just take one issue, the interior rooms that were decorated to Pugin's medieval designs. You've got plasterwork, you've got stonework, you have got paint, and it's not just the colour, it's the pigments that were used. And are the pigments stable? Do they look now the way they look when they were fresh 150 years ago?
Well, did you know that that's an issue that comes up in National Trust properties. So sometimes you'll have someone going in to restore wallpaper using original pigments, etc., and they'll be told, "Can you please restore that side of the room to reflect the fact that it's had 200 years of sunlight on it?"
Yes.
And so that it matches what it looks like now as opposed to what it looked like originally.
Absolutely. At the same time, there are issues like, for example, there are now something like 620 MPs, I think it is, under current boundaries. There aren't enough benches in the chamber of the House of Commons for them all to sit down. I'm looking at, you look at any of the big set piece events like the budget or a major speech or something like that, Prime Minister's questions on a contentious day, and it is absolutely rammed.
Yeah.
And
so just to return to my devil's advocate argument, then it is rammed. It is in many ways dangerous. It is in many ways falling apart. How about we embrace the need to have a 76-year rolling refurbishment, and actually Queen Elizabeth Tower, sorry, as was Victoria Tower, I think, looks magnificent. It's been cleaned,
or Big Ben, as people might know it better.
Yeah, exactly. Big Ben. It's been cleaned. The most recent an update was that the final face of the clock has been revealed. All faces are showing the correct time. The stonework is gleaming. The mortar has been replaced.
It's a stunning job.
It's really doable. It is doable. But okay, let that happen and let it become a museum to that history that you've described, and let's get a new Parliament building, because this is 22 billion pounds. Yeah. When if we look at the most recent government building that was Parliament building or Assembly building that was constructed in Britain, I think it was the Scottish one. We were wondering if it was Scottish or Welsh. It was the Scottish. Yeah. That cost around 460 something million in 2007. So we're talking about a while ago. Yeah. But let's say it's let's double it. Let's say it's £1 billion to build a new Parliament. That's still 1/22 of the cost to get this thing back up to spec, or to get it to any sort of spec, and also to ensure its future. And a new Parliament building, not only would it cost 1/22 of that, but also as well, we'd actually be able to give everyone a seat. They'd all actually get to sit in, as opposed to sort of cramming in like they're on the train from Newcastle to London.
I think, logically, you're right. And
thank you.
I said logically you're right. I didn't say you were right. Logically you're right, and that's the decision that was taken in Scotland and in Wales for the Senedd.
Yeah.
Both cases they opted to commission contemporary architects to design new purpose-built buildings. They didn't choose to adapt to an existing building for heritage, even buildings that might have had, some kind of, heritage pull, if you like. I think the problem you've got in Westminster is, and it's a nice problem to have in a sense, in that, first of all, it is over 1,000 years of being the centre of political power in London, in England, and latterly in Great Britain, and and even much of the world at one point. And I say for good or ill, you can't escape that heritage.
No.
And I'd also point out that, for example, between 2016 and 2019, when Britain was being absolutely riven by first of all the Brexit vote, and then the debate over Brexit and would we or wouldn't we leave, and under what terms, that Parliament Square outside the Houses of Parliament and Whitehall became an absolutely vibrant political space where there was a national debate going on. And on days of contentious votes, when there was a demonstration going on outside, the MPs on the inside could hear the voters that they are responsible to.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful situation to be in. I mean, I was there for many of those events, and there was a real sense. People talk about sense of history very glibly, and you did get a sense on some of those days that history was being made, not necessarily in a good way, but there was a particular vibrancy about that place at that time, and I think so people might be loath to lose that. The other thing I think is really important, just to make this point very quickly. One of the reasons this is happening is that Parliament and the parliamentary buildings, although there are World Heritage sites, so there's international agreements and international law involved and so on, Parliament famously, under the UK unwritten constitution, Parliament is sovereign. So this isn't being organised by Historic England. This isn't even being organised by the government. The parliamentary authorities, under the authority of the Speaker, organise this. And you mentioned Michael Gove earlier on, saying that as part of the Levelling Up initiative that the government is central to government policy at the moment, the House of Lords should move out to Stoke-on-Trent and even up to Sunderland. you need to say that the follow-up to that is that the Speaker of the House of Lords have basically told them to go and do one.
Yeah.
But it's up to the House of Lords to decide where they're going to go if they have to leave the chamber while it's refurbished, and nothing to do with the government. So that's part of that's absolutely emblematic of one of the reasons this is taking so long to sort out.
Okay, and fair enough, and I'll address each of those, my lord, each of those three things in sequence. So first of all, you said it's a nice problem to have. Is it a nice problem to have 117 people potentially being exposed to asbestos in the Speaker's residence? It's not. That's not necessarily a nice thing to have.
No, but look, this is whataboutery, though. Of course, it's not a good thing. Of course, it's not a good thing to be happening, and there are mitigations in place, and they're trying to sort it out. So next,
and we've got the fastest growing economy in the G7. Sorry, go
on. That's not true. But anyway,
that's not true at all. No. In all seriousness, I mean, I am being devil's advocate, but I am also, as I said, I'm asking a genuine question as to why it is we hold on to these things. When in previous times, I mean, I talked to you also before when we were writing the agenda about Trajan's column, yes. and that whole area of the forum where essentially he created a shopping mall, a multi-tiered space that people at that time, as far as we can tell, didn't have a sense that the future would be different in the same way that we do. So we tend to think of history as something that we preserve for the future. People previously used to think of things around them as more utilitarian. Of course, there was the notion of honouring temples, etc., and also in prehistory, so as we can tell, religious sites were tended for hundreds, if not thousands of years straight, with very little change occurring. But that change wasn't mandated in the same way that we tend to do to ourselves now, and I find it a fascinating quandary. That said, though, I'm not at all going to try and counter your point about access, because actually, especially with the current flavour of government we have, if they were to build a new £1 billion or £500 million government parliament building somewhere in London, they would also build into that no spaces where people can congregate. Priti Patel, our current Home Secretary, is not very happy with people who protest publicly on things, and I can imagine they would build in like a 5 mile, possibly 5 mile ring, that people can't come into and gather publicly. So
moats patrolled by the Royal Navy, probably with mines and sharks,
and crocodiles and
anything to stop them.
That's the point. Is that, as you say, in that sense, the structure, the building as an idea, as an embodiment of the relationship between people and power, is intriguing and interesting and serves its function very well. But crucially, at the moment, we all have well-trodden modes of access. We can go on to College Green. We can be heard inside the building. And it would be far more difficult to overturn those modes of access and to renegotiate. This is what we're talking about if we're going to get all anthropological. Renegotiate access to areas of power and corridors in and out of the heart of our form of democracy. If it was all starting from scratch. So I get it, I do, but I just cannot help but ask: is it worth £22 billion and 76 years of a human life? Or human lives, as it were.
To which I would say, in the past, medieval cathedrals famously took generations to build.
Yes, yeah.
And okay, that's partly a function of the technology that was available at the time. But people weren't afraid. People didn't need an instant delivery within a political cycle, which is one of the problems that we have at the moment. The longest political cycle we have is 5 years between general elections.
Yeah.
And although this isn't a party political issue, it is to do with public money, because this would largely be public money. And particularly at the moment with the cost of living crisis, any politician who stands up and says, I'm happy to spend X billion pounds to make the place I work better, is not likely to get re-elected very easily.
No.
So, although it's meant to be above politics, it's World Heritage we're talking about here. It's actually part and parcel of politics too, as we saw when Gove, knowing probably full well what kind of reaction he was going to get from the House of Lords, made that point about levelling up. He was doing it because it was politics, and that's the biggest problem we've got with this whole issue. It's politics. If it could all be handed over to a completely independent body that with only heritage considerations, and that could make arrangements for the chambers to sit in various other places. It's ironic, for example, that one of the suggestions has been to build a temporary chamber of the House of Commons on Whitehall behind some existing government buildings. One of the problems with that is that it would entail the demolition of, I think it's the old National Health Ministry of Health building on Whitehall, which is listed.
Right.
It's a modern building, but it's listed.
Yeah.
So you demolish a listed building to provide a temporary home for somebody who's being chucked out of a World Heritage site.
But again, I know it's counter to an archaeological instinct. Is listed status, the fact that London's so densely populated, full of old buildings, if it doesn't work for us, why do we have it all? I think it's an interesting question. I just think if you can't, if you want to preserve the Parliament building, fair enough. And one of the solutions is to knock down this other building. Why don't we knock down that other building?
Because it was judged to be of outstanding interest in a UK context and one of the top 5% of buildings that have been built in the UK. And it's actually it's a modern building. So it's one of the relatively few modern buildings that survives in London because they are falling at a rate of knots to redevelopment.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Hopefully, this has been an interesting conversation, folks, at home. I mean, I am doing the devil's advocate thing, but I am also, as I say, asking a genuine question because it is very particular. We live in a very particular time when this is possible. For example, the Victorians, they had a great love of history, but here in Newcastle, when they wanted to build a new train line, they demolished part of the castle after which Newcastle is named.
Same thing. Yep, same thing happened in Northampton. The castle was built and demolished to build the station.
Exactly. So why don't we do that? It's an interesting question, and I don't think we can answer it necessarily.
Past is another country. They do things different there.
They do things different there. They do. Any hint as to what next week's watching brief might be, Andy?
I suspect we're going to have more on the cuts. We're trying to find out more about the Heritage Railways estate. There's been a report issued this week which suggests that Highways England may have misrepresented the state of the Great Musgrave Bridge that we did the item about previously. It certainly fundamentally disagrees with their engineering assessment. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do something more on that. And there's a few other things bubbling away in the background, but I can't really be too specific at the minute.
No, we can't be. No. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your time, Andy. Until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.